Hi, good morning. I have, according to that clock down there, 3/4 of a football game without the benefit of timeouts. So what I'm going to try and do is talk for a while and then open this up for questions. When I wrote this book, it's the kind of book that you would only write when you were done consulting, when you weren't going to try and go out and get other clients. Because what I tried to do was tell the truth, not only about what I saw, the people I worked for, but about myself. And sometimes it hurts. But there was an attempt on my part to do nothing gratuitous that would inflict damage on people unintentionally. What I tried to do was capture the joy, the heartbreak, the nitty-gritty, and the mountaintops of politics. But I think what I'll do here is discuss specific campaigns and the things I write in the book in the context of our overarching themes. And then we'll turn to Q&A. The first thing I think is an important lesson if you spend a lot of time in politics is the importance of authenticity. Voters sense how real, how true to yourself you really are. In addition to presidential campaigns, I saw that in 30 winning Senate campaigns, 10 for governor, campaigns for the mayor of almost every major American city, and overseas from Colombia to Israel to Britain, Ireland, a whole variety of places. Now, I never saw a candidate who more embodied authenticity than someone many of you probably know, or at least know of, Barbara Mikulski, who was the first Democratic woman ever elected to the Senate on her own. I had known her for years. I went out to dinner with her. She was thinking about running for the Senate. She wasn't married, and she had a perfectly safe house seat. And she said, you know, I have to interview other people because that's due diligence. So, you know, I have to ask you what you would advise me to do. How do I change myself to be good on television? Because all the other people I talk to say I have to change to be good on television. And I said, well, Barbara, you know, you're short, fat, loud, and ethnic. And I think you ought to be short, fat, loud, and ethnic. And I also said to her, could you go off for a weekend and think about what you're going to do if you do this and you don't win? Because you have to be content with that possibility. So she came back, she called me Monday, she said, I'm going to run, you're hired. Our first shoot was rained out, our first film shoot. So, and so she said, well, let's go to the Lexington market. We rescheduled it for the next day. Let's go to the Lexington market. And we had, you know, Lexington market is, Baltimore is full of these places that are big, open markets, covered. You can get a sandwich, you can buy fish, you can do anything you want. So as we walk through, everybody knows her. Everybody keeps saying, hi, Barb, or how are you? Or what's going on? How's your mother? I mean, all these questions. And I thought, you know what? We're going to cancel the shoot tomorrow. We're just going to bring her and the camera here, and we're going to follow her around and watch her interact with people. And we got this extraordinary spot out of it where Barbara, by the way, likes to claim that she's 5'2". She's actually 4'10". And we got this extraordinary spot out of it where some older woman walks up to her and says, jeepers, dear, you've lost weight. And she says, I'm counting my calories, counting my blessings, and counting my votes. And then there's a guy at a fish counter, and she comes up to about this high on the fish counter, and she says, I'm trying to save the bay so we can save the fish, so we can save your business. And then some old guy in a hard hat, and it was the end of the spot, looks at her and says, ain't nobody going to beat you, you're the best. What she had was a power of cultural connection with people so strong that I've hardly ever seen anything like it in a candidate. She served 5 terms in the Senate. She never got less than 60 to 75% of the vote. Now, other candidates are truly authentic as well, but she was from the top of her head to the tip of her toes, all 4 feet 10 of her, a totally authentic person, and voters knew it, and they trusted her. We took her, and when she was running for re-election, actually, we took her to an Orioles game. There is nothing more dangerous in life than to take a politician to a sporting event. It's almost guaranteed to get boos. back when I was very young and I was working for John Lindsay, who was the mayor of New York, he said, do you want to go to the Ali Frazier fight with us? And I said, sure. So we're walking in, and the guy in Madison Square Garden says, ladies and gentlemen, the mayor of the city of New York, Mayor John V. Lindsay, and people start booing, and the Apollo 13 astronauts, which turns it into a complete cheer. So we take her to the game, and as she walks in, people see her. We had a camera. People see her, and everybody cheered. Now, any politician who can achieve that kind of status is blessed because people trust them. They know that they care about them. The second point I would make is about the centrality of message. Message really matters. Think about 2016, and it's very uncomfortable for me personally to talk about this, but Donald Trump had a very simple, understandable message. He was going to make America great again by cracking down on immigration and trade. And he went into those places in the Rust Belt where people felt that they had been abandoned, their communities had been hollowed out, and he told them, the problem is all these immigrants taking your jobs. Wasn't true, but at least in my view, but people believed it. And the problem is all these trade agreements. So those folks, there were folks who moved from voting for Obama twice to voting for Donald Trump. Think about Hillary Clinton's message, stronger together. It really wasn't a message about her. It was a message about him and what was wrong with him. His character flaws became a bright, shining object, so that when the Hollywood Access tape came out, instead of the Clinton campaign moving on to a message, for example, that compared his economic plan and hers, which she could arguably have said, look, he's really actually fooling, he's just going to help rich people, here's what I want to do. It became a bright, shining object, and all they did was keep running ads about what a bum Trump was. Well, people already thought he was a bum. And in fact, he had an unfavorable, on the day he got elected, President of the United States, from a lot of voters who voted for him. But they thought maybe he'll do something about my problems. To take a different example, think about the 2008 election. In the primaries in 2008, Barack Obama ran as the candidate of hope and change, and Hillary Clinton ran as the candidate of restoration. What happens in Iowa before the Iowa caucuses is about 2 months before, people asked a question, and the question determines, at least in the Democratic Party, who's going to win the caucuses. The question, for example, in 2004 was, who plausibly might beat Bush? And the voters of Iowa decided that Howard Dean wasn't the answer, and they voted for John Kerry. In 2008, the question was, who stands most for change? And so the attempt to make experience the deciding issue on the part of first Hillary Clinton and then John McCain fell flat. Of course, John McCain also had the problem that once he picked Sarah Palin, and she said she could see Russia from her front porch, the experience issue kind of left the campaign. But voters, not candidates, decide what the election is about. You have to meet them where they are, and you have to have a message that resonates with them. The third thing I would talk about is the role of negative attacks. Now, there's an incredible confusion of terms here. The phrase covers a multitude of tactics. It could cover Willie Horton ads. It could cover the kind of stuff that you saw from Trump at the end where Lloyd Blankfein, I mean, a spot that I thought arguably was anti-Semitic that was run at the end of the campaign. That kind of stuff is one category of thing. But there are negative attacks that pass the test of both truth and relevance. So let me give you an example. In 1994, Edward Kennedy had never had a serious election in Massachusetts since 1962, when he got elected to the Senate. But in 1994, for a variety of reasons, he was in trouble. And somebody said, and I was doing the campaign, somebody said, well, Romney's not really going to run. And I said, yes, he is. And they said, well, he really didn't have that much money. He's not going to spend all that money. I said, yes, he is. And in the summer, we were about 15, 18 points ahead. And we were on TV, and so was Romney. And I said, we have to stay on TV. And I lost that battle, as Teddy said to me later, you know, you're my friend, but you're also the television guy. And I thought, well, you know, we don't need to do this if we're this far ahead. So we took a poll, and the day before the primary, I got a call from the pollster who said we're 1 point behind. Romney had run nothing but television all summer, had run attacks on Kennedy, had run positive for himself. We're 1 point behind. I said, well, can you jigger your figures a little so that when we go see him tomorrow night, we can tell him he's 1 point ahead? I said, I know it's in the margin of error. It doesn't make any difference, but psychologically it makes a difference. So we met in his apartment. He had an apartment in Back Bay in Boston, as well as a house in Hyannisport. And somebody said, well, first we should decide what the budget is. And he said, no, the budget is whatever it needs to be. First, we should hear from Bob about what we're going to do about this. And I said, well, we've got some pretty good attacks that we can, and he had never run a negative ad in Massachusetts. We've got some pretty good attacks that we can run, and I want to start with the second best, which is Romney's opposition to an increase in the minimum wage. And Vicki Kennedy, who's a great friend of mine, said, why don't we want to start with the first, the strongest argument? I said, because the strongest argument is what he did to some of his workers in business. And I don't want to do that with a narrator. I want to go out and film the workers. And so we started with the minimum wage. And I actually wrote a script for the workers because I didn't know how they were going to do. And my partner, Tad Devine, who, by the way, did Bernie Sanders' campaign in 2016 and made that marvelous ad that had no words at all, but just music about America. He went out to film the ads, and he called me. He said, we don't need the script. These workers are unbelievable. And there were people who would say things like, I don't like Romney talking about creating jobs. He took away all of ours. And then somebody else would say, he took away the health insurance. They fired us and hired us back at half as much money. These ads were completely devastating. We did something very unusual. We ran all 5 of them in rotation at once so that people couldn't say to themselves, well, this is just a couple disgruntled people. And we went from being 1 point behind to being about 14 points ahead, and I'll talk later on about the other thing that happened in that campaign. What amazed me in 2012 was Obama used some of the same ads. He used some of the same people, made the same arguments, and Romney didn't answer. There was never an effective answer. I would think if I was going to run for president of the United States and I had 18 years to think, or 20 years, whatever it was, to think about this, I would have come up with an answer. I think the reason they didn't, and this often happens in campaigns, is because they thought, the Romney people, that the election was just a referendum. If you're kind of unhappy about what's happening in America, if you think we haven't recovered fast enough, might as well give me a try. And what Obama did was turn it into a choice about who stands up for you. And he used the worker ads, for example, as a very powerful indicator of what Romney's values were and whose side he was on. Romney himself, by the way, did not help his case with the 47% tape. Those are things in politics that happen, and you just, you figure out how you're going to deal with them. It took him 2 or 3 days to say he was wrong, and then he said it kind of awkwardly. But negatives really matter, and voters are pretty smart most of the time. The negative has to go to the heart of the other person's case. It can't be, well, he did X, and people say, I don't care about X. I'll give you an example. Since Kamala Harris announced, there's been a lot of publicity in some places about, especially in conservative places, about the fact that she used to go out with Willie Brown. Who cares? I don't think voters care a hoot if they decide that she's the right person. The fourth thing I want to talk about is debates and the impact of debates and how important they are. One thing you can say about debates is you can almost always anticipate what the opponent will say and get ready for it. In 1988, I'm now aging myself, but I could go even further back to 72. In 1988, I noticed, and Maureen Dowd, who was here at the Writers' Conference, actually wrote about it in the New York Times, that Dan Quayle, the Republican vice presidential nominee, had a habit of going around on the trail comparing himself to John Kennedy. I have a rule, actually, which is I always tell candidates, don't bother with that comparison. It's not going to help you. And I would say to a Republican, don't claim you're Ronald Reagan. That's not going to help you. But Quayle made that comparison all the time. And so in debate prep, I actually first wrote a kind of little draft speech or speech excerpt for Ted Kennedy to give and about this. And he said, oh, no. He said, give this to Benson for the vice presidential debate. And so, and by the way, Benson deserves a huge amount of credit for the way it was done, because he figured out how to say, he was my, I knew Jack Kennedy, I served with Jack Kennedy was my friend. But I started off in the thing, and I told him about this, and I said, do you feel comfortable talking about it? And he said, sure. And that line got honed, and it got honed by Benson himself. And it's one of those moments that, it didn't win the election for Dukakis. I don't think at that point almost anything could have, but it finished off Dan Quayle as a force in national politics and became an incredibly memorable moment. Now, if I could return for a second to the Kennedy-Romney campaign, after the worker ads, I'm sitting with Mary Louise in a restaurant in Washington having, I think we're celebrating George Will's wife's birthday. There were just 4 of us. I lived in a Washington where Republicans and Democrats and conservatives and liberals talked to each other. And I wish we had that again. We're sitting there, and the maitre d' comes and says, there's a call for you. Why don't you take it in the back room? And I get on the phone, and they say, the Boston Globe and the Boston Herald have gotten together and demanded that Kennedy and Romney debate. And if Kennedy won't debate, the Boston Globe won't endorse him. Now, I had been quite anxious once we got about 15 points ahead to avoid a debate. Why have a debate? You're going to win. At that point, we had to have a debate. And I never saw anybody as disciplined as Ted Kennedy was in preparing for that debate. For I think we had 6 days of debate prep, and it went all day. And we'd have a question. He'd say, you get up and answer it. I'd get up and answer it. I'd sit down. He'd get up. He'd say, now ask me. He'd answer it. And I mean, we really prepared. But you could know some of what Romney was going to say. And one of the things he telegraphed was that he was going to claim that the Kennedys had gotten a sweetheart deal to invest in the Furniture Mart in Southwest Washington. Now, I don't know how many of you know the geography of Washington in the 80s and 90s. Southwest, especially along the freeway, what's now the National Stadium is there and all this stuff. Nothing was there, or terrible things were there. And so Kennedy had no idea what they were talking about. We found out that it was a trust for the 3rd generation. There was a perfectly logical answer. And the city had come to it and said, look, we're desperately trying to develop Southwest. Can you put the Furniture Mart in Southwest? And that's how it got there. So we had a logical answer, but there was a lot more powerful one. And the more powerful one, which we practiced over and over in the prep, was, and by the way, Romney walked right into it and gave Kennedy the opening. The answer was, Mr. Romney, my family did not go into politics to make money. And quite frankly, we paid a price. And it blew the roof off Faneuil Hall. The debate was over. There was another great moment, by the way, which we had not practiced, where Romney was asked about the cost of his health care proposal. He said, I can't give you a figure. I can't take you through my bill provision by provision. And Kennedy looked at him and said, but that's what you have to do when you legislate, Mr. Romney. So debates can really matter. The same thing happened with Kerry and Bush in 2004, I think, which is that you noticed, if you watched him, that President Bush used 9/11 to justify the Iraq War. And invading Iraq, Al-Qaeda had nothing to do with Iraq. So Kerry had a mantra in his head. He says Saddam, you say Osama. So Jim Lehrer asked a question to President Bush, what would your criteria be for invading a country again? And Bush, sure enough, says, well, of course we had to invade Iraq. We got attacked. And Kerry, you could just see. You look at his face, and you could see he knew. And he said, Jim, he just said something really extraordinary. Saddam Hussein didn't attack us. Osama bin Laden attacked us. And Bush then made the mistake of saying, I know who attacked us. One of the things you don't do if you're caught in one of these things in a debate, you don't try to come back with a kind of weak answer. Quayle actually came back with, Senator, that was uncalled for. And Quayle looked at him and said, Senator, you're the one who made the comparison, not I. I mean, so you can make things worse by trying to come back. Now, you don't necessarily win these things because you win debates. Some people would argue, I would argue, that Kerry won all three of the debates in 2004. Certainly the first debate, he went from being about 8 points behind to being about 4 or 5 points ahead. So you don't win them, but they're really critical, and sometimes they actually make the most fundamental difference. And my last point on debates will be Richard Nixon running in 1960 is running on experience. Experience counts. Those are the signs. And he goes into the first debate, and Sander Van Oker, who was a correspondent for NBC, they asked him like twice about experience. And the third time, Van Oker looks at him and says, Mr. Vice President, your campaign has plastered the country with signs saying experience counts. But last week, President Eisenhower was asked at a press conference if he could name one thing that you had made a major contribution to during the course of his administration, and he said, if you give me a week, I might think of something. Now, how do you respond to that, and how do you square it with the experience argument you're making? You know what? There is no answer to that question. I mean, Nixon had an answer, but there's no answer. It's just a devastating moment, and then if you go through the debate, as Kennedy did, and you either equal or better the person who looks presumptively like who's ready to be president, and you look equal or better, then that whole issue goes away. Experience is a threshold issue. People don't say who has more experience. They say, does this person have enough experience? And if they do, then they move on to the next issue. The final thing, and then I'll turn to some questions, is, well, actually, it's two things. First, in the social media age, do speeches matter? Sometimes. Ronald Reagan, and this is before the social media age, in the 1976 Democratic Convention, almost beat Ford for the Republican nomination. He lost just barely. Ford gave a very good acceptance speech, one of the best I've ever heard, actually. But Reagan was sitting way up in a box with Nancy Reagan, and at the end, Ford, and nobody had told Reagan he was going to do this, keeps summoning him down, and the crowd keeps chanting for him. And Reagan comes down, and he gives about a 4-minute speech, with, sort of, I think, standard stump stuff that he had been using, but in this context, it had great emotional power. And he set himself up for 1980. It was the first speech of the 1980 campaign. By the way, he mentioned Ford in it once. I mean, what Ford was hoping for, I think, was a full-throated endorsement. He got a kind of mild endorsement, and Reagan setting out his standard, no pale colors in the Republican Party, no compromise, and it was very powerful. Obama, in 2008, as the social media age was really gaining traction, Jeremiah Wright, the pastor of his church in Chicago, as you all remember, was revealed to have made a whole host of incendiary remarks that I am not going to repeat. And it was the one moment when Obama already mathematically was headed for the nomination, when he could have been derailed. And he went to the Constitution Center in Philadelphia, where he gave a speech that did two things. First, he made himself credible. He said, did I go to the church sometimes and hear things I disagreed with? Yes. Did I hear those particular remarks? No. What if he'd said, I never heard any of it? I never heard anything I disagreed with. So he didn't go to church? He belonged to the church but didn't go to church. So he made himself credible. But he also, and that let him dismiss Wright as his former pastor, but he did something bigger. He eloquently wrapped the whole speech in a larger theme about race and American ideals. He had actually tried to avoid talking about race during the 2008 campaign, and suddenly he embraced talking about it. And he talked about his children who have the blood of slaveholders and former slaves flowing in their veins. He talked about his white grandfather who served in World War II and his white grandparents who had raised him. It was a very, very powerful speech. One other speech that I'll talk about because it's interesting and because I had something to do with it is Senator Kennedy's speech to the 1980 Democratic Convention when he lost the presidential nomination to Jimmy Carter. Now, Kennedy had started out far ahead. The Iranian hostages were seized. President Carter said, I can't spend a moment of my time on political campaigns, so I'm not going to debate. I'm not going to go on the campaign trail. And so Kennedy is out there, and although at the end he won all the primaries at the end, mathematically he could not win the nomination. The hostages, by the way, which helped Carter, in my view, in the spring, doomed him in the fall. But we were determined that Kennedy would get a chance to be seen and heard in front of the country. And we did it on the platform amendments. That was our excuse on the second night. We were given 15 minutes. He took 47. The speech became famous, but it illustrates some principles. A good speech is not linear. It's not a legal argument. It's not problem-solution. It actually rises and falls like a symphony. There are periods when you don't want everybody applauding all the time. There are other periods when you really want to get people going. And I'm going to give you two examples. Kennedy offered a kind of master class in how to confront Reagan if you wanted to take him on. I'll read you a couple of them. The same Republicans who are talking about the crisis of unemployment have nominated a man who once said, and I quote, unemployment insurance is a prepaid vacation plan for freeloaders. And that nominee is no friend of labor. And talk about the inner city, Social Security. Then the same Republicans who are talking about preserving the environment have nominated a man who last year made the preposterous statement, and I quote, 80% of air pollution comes from plants and trees. And that nominee is no friend of the Environment. Convention is going crazy at this point. And the same Republicans who are invoking Franklin Roosevelt, whom Reagan liked to quote all the time, have nominated a man who said in 1976, and these are his exact words, fascism was really the basis of the New Deal. And that nominee, whose name is Ronald Reagan, has no right to quote Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So the convention is going crazy. People are applauding. Then you get near the end. And it's what I mean by a speech being a symphony. You'd think if you were going to build, you'd start with problem, solution, people cheering at the end. Someday, long after this convention, long after the signs come down and the crowd stop cheering and the band stop playing, may it be said of our campaign that we kept the faith. May it be said of our party in 1980 that we found our faith again. And may it be said of us both in dark passages and in bright days, in the words of Tennyson that my brothers quoted and loved, and that have a special meaning for me now. I am a part of all that I have met. Though much is taken, much abides. That which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, strong in will to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. For me, a few hours ago, this campaign came to an end. For all those whose cares have been our concern, the work goes on, the cause endures, the hope still lives, and the dream shall never die. Now, that speech was also designed to set Kennedy up for 1984. But the allusion to his brothers, by the way, which is elliptical, is far more powerful because he doesn't name them. Everybody in their heads sees them when he says that, but he chose never to run again. Final speech example would be Al Gore in 2000. Everybody said Al Gore was stiff. And in fact, in private, he's one of the funniest, loosest, most enjoyable people I know. So we really, really worked on this speech. And we kept saying, talk faster, talk faster, talk faster. You have to surf the applause. And there was huge energy in that speech, and you suddenly could see that the convention crowd was saying to itself, oh my God, he can pull this off. And he gained 13 to 18 points in about 45 minutes in one speech. I don't think that's ever happened before. That brings me to my very last point, which is you have to deal with crises and the unexpected. I mentioned the hostages. But the greatest unexpected of my time in politics was the butterfly ballot in Florida and the votes there that were never counted after the Supreme Court made Bush president by a margin of 5-4. Pat Buchanan, who was a third-party candidate and who got 18,000 votes in heavily Jewish precincts on the Gold Coast because of the butterfly ballot, once said to me, there were not 18,000 Jews on the Gold Coast trying to vote for me. They were trying to vote for Gore. That alone would have changed the election. Anyway, it was an excruciating 37 days. I'll conclude by apologizing to the Republicans in the audience, but by saying, as I have before, that Al Gore was elected, he just wasn't inaugurated. And that had some pretty big consequences after 9/11 and in terms of the climate crisis. So I've enjoyed this little tour with you through my book, my memories, my experiences, and I'd love to take questions. Yeah.
I have a question. How do you feel? I've got two questions. First of all, what do you see for 2020 as far as message goes? And how do you feel about Stacey Abrams being the speaker after the State of the Union?
How do I feel about Stacey Abrams being the speaker after the State of the Union? I think it's a great idea. She's very powerful. She's eloquent. The country doesn't really know her, but I think she'll probably do a great job. What do I see happening in 2020? Unless Howard Schultz mounts a serious, really serious, credible campaign and draws a lot of votes away from Democrats, I think it's very hard for Trump to get reelected. He has a 33%. In my view, he has a 33% hardcore. He went down to 34% during the shutdown, but I think 33% of people will stick with him no matter what. But I also think he has a ceiling of about 42%. And he's got a base strategy which is premised on the idea that he's going to rely on the kind of folks that helped him last time, but he's going to ignore young people, he's going to ignore suburban women, he's going to ignore minorities, he's going to ignore the LGBT community. I don't think you can pull it off twice. I mean, he drew to an inside straight last time. 38,000 votes switch in 3 states, and he's no longer president of the United States. Now, that's almost impossible to pull off twice. And I think he has a lot more baggage and a lot more negatives today than he did then. Yes?
Yeah, so I just wondered if he would run again.
I was asked, do I think Trump will run again? You know, on election day, I didn't think he was going to win, apparently, if you read all the books. He was going to go out and, do a television show or a television network. I think he really loves all the saluting and the Air Force One and, the other stuff. I mean, most presidents do, some more, some or less. But I think for him, that's the really big reason to be president. He also never likes to walk away from anything, although he just walked away from the government shutdown. He may try by executive order to build his wall. The wall thing amazes me because yesterday, Lindsey Graham came out of a meeting with him and said, I told him to tie wall funding to the increase in the national debt. Now, that's a really good idea. We would build a wall by collapsing the full faith and credit of the United States and destroying the dollar as the reserve currency of the world. I would hope and think he wouldn't do that, but I think he'll run again. I don't think he can possibly help himself. Yeah.
Bob, you may not want to answer this, but who do you see on the Democratic ticket?
I don't know. There are going to be about 20 candidates. And I figured out the other day that if you had a 90-minute debate, and let's say you had 15 candidates, they'd each get 4 minutes if you factor in the notion that you have to have time to ask the questions. So it's going to be a really interesting process. Biden starts out as the front runner if he decides to run. But there may be an inchoate desire in the party to move on generationally. I think one thing that's interesting is you get the sense that somehow or other Bernie Sanders is coming down a little, and the public opinion polls tend to reflect that. He may split some of the vote with Elizabeth Warren. Kamala Harris had one of the most spectacular starts to a campaign I've ever seen. But this is a long test. Lots of unexpected things happen. And as I said earlier, voters are going to ask, as you get toward Iowa and New Hampshire, they're going to ask a fundamental question. And I think the fundamental question is likely this time to be once again, who in the hell can beat this guy? And that's going to be an acid test for Democratic voters. Yeah. And I'm going to come back there then. Go ahead.
You didn't spend much time on Gore. I had one question. I used to watch him during that campaign, or during that one particular debate, and he kept referring to lockbox.
Oh, God.
I was wondering who might have advised him.
Me. Me. What happened was, the question is about why did Gore talk about the lockbox so much in the first debate? Two things. First, we gave him 3 things that he wasn't supposed to do. Don't argue with the moderator, don't invade Bush's space, and don't react to Bush while he's talking. It was like we gave him a to-do list, and he sighed all the time. But we also had said, and he had made a promise in the campaign, that he was going to put the money for Social Security and Medicare in a lockbox so it couldn't be used. And we practiced it, and he delivered it once or twice, and it was very good. He did it 5 times in the first debate. It was a big mistake. He almost knocked Bush over when he was shaking hands with him, to the point where Barbara Bush went on television on one of the the 11:30 shows and said, "I was afraid he was going to hurt poor George." So Gore, who is a brilliant debater, won that debate on points, but he lost it on all of the atmospherics. But if you say, where did the lockbox come from originally? Me. Okay. Yeah, in the back.
Given the fact that Trump accuses every one of his opponents of doing things he himself has done, what do you think his voter fraud thing may have to do with the 38,000 votes you mentioned before?
I don't think there was voter fraud in Wisconsin, and I don't. There's no voter fraud in this country. There was Russian interference in the election. Comey, despite her problems, Hillary would have won without Comey's intervention. But the incidence, the Brennan Center says the incidence of voter fraud in this country is de minimis, or less than de minimis. 1/10 or 1/100th of 1%. So I don't buy the idea that somehow or other Trump stole Michigan, Wisconsin, or Pennsylvania. He won them. I mean, we knew in 2000, 2004, Clinton knew in 96 and 92 that he was going to win Michigan. And guess what you did? You spent money on television. You sent the candidate there. You organized. You had people on the ground. Hillary never went to Wisconsin. I had a friend, Chuck Campion, who since died, who was sort of our Mr. Michigan. We always sent him out there. The Democrats always sent him out there. And he went out maybe a week and a half before the election, and he called the Clinton campaign in Brooklyn, and he said, "You got a big problem here in Michigan." And they said, no, we've run 200,000 data analytics simulations, and we win 98.2% of the time. He said, well, you better start worrying about the other 1.8%. So even if you're in good shape in these states, the ones that are kind of on the margins but reliably yours, you can't take for granted. You have to go fight for them. Yes?
Bob, it used to be it's the economy stupid. How significant will the economy be in the 2020 election?
It's really, how significant will the economy be in 2020? It's really interesting. Normally in 2018, if you had this kind of economy, you would not have seen the Democratic gains that we saw. Trump overtakes everything else. 3.7% unemployment, stock market going up, all these other indexes are in pretty good shape, and people say, okay, that's fine. Now, to some extent, they think it's inherited from Obama, but beyond that, their problems with Trump are not about the economy, although they may become so. I mean, depending on what he does on trade, some of the people who voted for him, like some of these farmers, are going to be in terrible trouble. But assuming the economy is good, I don't think it's going to be a central issue in 2020. I just think Trump is the issue. He likes being the center of attention. He is going to be the center of the campaign. All the way in the back, because I promised you before. Go ahead.
Micro-targeting and technology, how has that changed over the years?
Well, we didn't used to have it, and it's both useful and a trap. It's very useful because you can micro-target messages to people. You can figure out what they care about. There are two traps. One is if you think all you need is a bunch of little micro messages and you don't need a big message up here that provides air cover for everything else you're doing, you're going to get in trouble. The second thing is if you think you can take data analytics and substitute it for polling. So you can look at people's past voting patterns, their habits, their consumer habits, predict how they vote. If data analytics had been accurate in the Clinton campaign, then she'd be president of the United States. They didn't poll in the battleground states in the last 2 weeks. Didn't do real, regular, conventional polling. I find that absolutely unbelievable, to go out and spend $1 billion running for president and not do that. Yeah. Yes? Well, people campaign differently overseas. In Britain, you don't have any TV ads, for example. You don't have them in Ireland. You have posters, you have daily press conferences, you have all this other stuff. And in Israel, really, it's fascinating. They run all the political ads at one time, like in a 45-minute block on television in prime time. Can you imagine that in the United States? I mean, no one would watch. But it was in the 99 election of Ehud Barak against Benjamin Netanyahu, people were really, really into. So we're getting like 50, 60% viewership every night. The message matters. It matters no matter where, at least as far as I know from the places I've been, it matters no matter where you campaign, no matter where you are. But you have to convey it in different ways. Yes, ma'am. And then I'll do the J. There are two questions. What do I think of Sherrod Brown as a 2020 candidate? I think he's a very attractive, strong candidate. He appeals to a lot of the voters that we lost last time, but at the same time, he has real bridges to the rising electorate, to the new Democratic electorate. And he's won in Ohio a couple of times, you know, when the state hasn't been going so well for Democrats. I know Bill Burton. Bill Burton used to be a friend of mine. Probably will be a friend of mine again someday. But I think he should not have gone to work for Howard Schultz. I think Howard Schultz. Now, Howard Schultz has had, I said that Kamala Harris had a spectacular launch. Howard Schultz has so far had a spectacular belly flop into an empty swimming pool. I mean, it's not like people have overwhelmingly welcomed this, and I'm not going to repeat what the guy said to him in the bookstore. But that's probably the part of his announcement tour that's gotten the most attention. Yeah.
Did any other people of your prominence prior to the election see Trump coming, the phenomenon coming?
Well, I certainly didn't. I thought he was going to be the Republican nominee. I did not think he was going to win. Mike Murphy and I went on the Circus on Showtime the Sunday before and said, I said, Mike agreed with me, absolutely no way, not in this universe, not in any alternative universe, not in any imaginable universe can Donald Trump be elected president of the United States. So take everything I said today with a grain of salt. Yeah. Fact-checking is not a scam. It just doesn't, people don't pay attention to it because we've entered an era where, as you know, Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to say, everybody's entitled to their own opinions, no one's entitled to their own facts. With social media, the proliferation of cable networks, everybody gets their own facts. And they stick by their own facts, they believe their own facts. The Washington Post says he lied 8,700 times so far. And yes, that's hurt him, but for that 33% or 34% who really care about him, they don't care. It just doesn't matter to them. I have like 43 seconds, yes.
Isn't Joe Biden the least divisive candidate?
I think isn't Joe Biden the least divisive candidate? I think the Democratic Party on the whole would be quite happy if Joe Biden were the nominee. And I know Donald Trump would be quite unhappy because Biden matches up very well against him in those places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and he'll do just as well as any other Democrat or even better in places like California. They're going to turn this off in a minute, so I want to say thank you all very much. I really enjoyed it.